Good evening to all of you from the North Cap University and welcome to the School of Law Masterclass, a series that aims to bring the real world issues and discussions into the classroom. Over the past 25 years, the North Cap University has been a natural meeting of talented students and faculty. Our graduates from law, management, and engineering disciplines are sought after in leading global universities and companies. The reason we are a top university is simple. At NCU, all education is contemporary and focused on the future. We take great efforts to impart knowledge and develop skills relevant for today's times and for the future. The same intent drives our recent collaboration with Arizona State University, the leading American university. Our partnership is exclusively the first of its kind in India in terms of coverage, breadth, and depth, all designed to give you a degree that will be an asset in your hands over the rest of your working lives. Dear students, the foundation of a modern society rests on the ideas of fundamental personal rights and justice. From ancient Sparta to Soviet Union, there are no examples in history of a human society flourishing when individual freedoms are taken away. Without justice, there can be no guarantees for your liberty or even your security. And today we live in a technology-dominated world where the social media has taken charge of our lives. The rise of fake news, hate speech, and intolerance threaten the fabric of our civil society, as we saw during the Delhi riots in 2020. Against the alleged hate speech, there has always been a counter narrative about freedom of speech and expression guaranteed by the Article 19 of our Constitution. Our guest today will talk about this complex subject. Let me introduce him. Mr. Saurabh Kirpal is Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. He has rich experience over 2 decades and has appeared in matters covering a wide range of subjects from commercial to constitutional law. This is reflected in the variety of clients he has represented, from Anil Ambani in his legal battle with his brother, to being the counsel for Navtej Johar, Ritu Dalmia and others in the case that led to reading down of Section 377 of Indian Penal Code. A self-declared accidental activist, he is a trustee of the NAS Foundation, the NGO that first fought for the decriminalization of homosexuality in India. He is the author of the book Sex and the Supreme Court, an anthology of issues related to law, gender, and sexuality. Prior to starting his full-time practice, he has worked with United Nations in Geneva. Mr. Kirpal graduated with a degree in law from the Oxford University and has completed Masters in Law from the Cambridge University. Today, he will speak on the topic free speech, promise and reality. As always, you can write your questions and responses in the chat. Mr. Kirpal, very good evening to you and welcome to the North Cap University. Oh, we can hear you well now.
Right. I think there was on a lighter vein, an attempt to suppress my freedom of speech by getting me muted by my computer system. I think we all think Big Brother is watching, and little do we know how true that is. I mean, for instance, every time I use Alexa or any other such allegedly helpful technological device, I find within 2 minutes I start getting ads of that which I searched for. So free speech, I don't know whether it truly exists or whether I'm just a commodity now, which a lot of us have become. But in any case, you'll all be glad to hear that I've set myself on a timer and I won't speak for very, very, very long. I have a lot to say, but I'll try not to bore you. I mean, a large number of you come on a Friday afternoon. And when I was a student, I assure you, I had much better things to do than to go and hear any lecture or speech on a Friday evening. But thank you to all of you for coming to hear me on what I think is a very, very, very important topic, which is why as I said, I want to speak for a bit And then I want to get your questions, partly because I want to see what the youth of India today is thinking, partly because I may be so confusing when I speak that you wouldn't have understood and you'll have to give me an opportunity to clarify. But more than that, I find it another marketplace of ideas in terms of questions. And that just neatly brings me into the question of free speech, promise, and reality, right? And we will discuss each of these two things, promise and reality. What is it that the Constitution has promised us? What is it that the courts have done? But more importantly, I think today what is relevant is what the reality is. You may be promised very many things, but on the ground, I find often that the promise is betrayed or at the very least not fulfilled. And we will have to try to analyze as to what it is that has caused us to have less freedom today, at least in my perspective, than we did some time ago. But every time I say something like that we have less freedom today, I think we have a tendency of glorifying our past. And I hope today, at least some part of what I will do is to give you a brief history of the right of freedom of speech, to show that there has always been a struggle between the law and the Constitution and its promises on the one hand, and that what the executive has always wanted to do, which is suppress free speech. It is not this government, it is governments across the world which always try to suppress free speech because it is in their interests to try to control the populace. So as if they're a government, to make sure that the narrative is theirs and they are not questioned. If it's a bureaucracy, that they are not called into question by anyone else, by the media. So the incentive is always there very deeply and greatly to control free speech, which is why we have constitutional guarantees. Because we must ask ourselves, what is it that is the value of free speech? Why is it important? We all say it's important. And I would say that there are two real reasons as to why free speech is important. Two different schools of thought, so to say. One is that free speech is good in itself. As a value, it's important to have. Because if I'm an individual and I'm restrained from speaking out, if I'm stopped from saying what is in my mind, if I can't go to Facebook or Twitter or to any other media I want and openly express myself about what I'm thinking for any fear whatsoever, it diminishes me as a human being. It lessens my dignity, it lessens my autonomy, it lessens my sense of self-worth, right? So free speech is an important constitutional value in itself. But typically that is not why free speech has been protected. Because there is a separate and a very valuable purpose of free speech. It's a speech that it's a control on the ends of any particular thing. What do I mean by that? While it may be valuable in itself, the consequences of living in a society with free speech are very, very positive. So for instance, there is a generation of what is called the marketplace of ideas. If there are 1 million people speaking, presumably, and I'm alluding to Adam Smith there, who believed that if there's an economic freedom, then eventually the most efficient actor will come to the top. So free speech enables that. It enables kind of a free market, liberalized economy of ideas, words, thoughts, and actions. And by their promulgation and propagation in the populace at large, ultimately the best idea will come forward, and that will help the society be propelled forward. But equally importantly, another very important thing that free speech does is it allows for democratic dissent in a peaceful manner. It is effectively what Justice Chandrachud had said it's a safety valve in a democracy. Rather than going out and trying to overthrow a government, if you can put your point across and have it examined and heard, of course, any idea must be examined. But if you have that capacity to be able to speak, you see, therefore, you have a greater democratic engagement. So this, I think, is the value of free speech per se. And of course, that brings us neatly again to what is the guarantee of free speech. We all know Article 19, right? Article 19(1)(a), is the promise of free speech in our constitution. And we all know what it reads like today. And this is why I want you to have a bit of historical context to this. Because, as I said in the beginning, this friction between the right and the effect it has on the executive has lasted from 1950, right? The Constitution was promulgated in November 1949, came into force in 26th of January 1950. That's why we celebrate Republic Day. We have a holiday that day, not just for any other reason, but because the Constitution came into being on that date. And the right that had been contained in originally in the Constitution was a free right to speech. And our constitutional scheme is such that it offers you a right and then allows the executive to impede on that right, to infringe on that right to a limited extent as specified in the Constitution. Because we cannot live in a society where there is no restriction on free speech, right? The very common example that is given is, I don't have the right to go into a cinema hall and say fire, because that will lead to chaos. So you are permitted to restrain free speech for certain valuable goals in a society. So when the Constitution was first promulgated, there was just such a restriction, which was far narrower than what it is today. The restriction that was allowed in 1950 was only on accounts of libel, slander, defamation, contempt of court. There was no separate thing on public order or security of the state. These restrictions which exist today and allow the legislature or the executive to say, look, if you speak freely, this will be violative of public order or security of the state. This did not exist at that point of time. And relying on this very expansive free speech, certain judgments came. And this also is an interesting point as to, when you're sitting in Parliament debating the Constitution, you are Dr. Ambedkar, you are Jawaharlal Nehru, you are the great worthies, and you don't actually think about what free speech means. A very expansive and wide right was given, thinking that we have suffered so many years under the British colonial rule, and it is time now for us to be free. We promise this right to our citizens. But of course, when a right is given, that right is used. And when a right is used, it becomes problematic. And that's when you go back to your drawing board and say, what did I do? And precisely something like this happened. In 1950, within 6 months of the Constitution coming into force, there were 3 cases that came up. One was a case, interestingly, again, left and right. There was a case of the RSS starting a pamphlet in East Punjab. And the East Punjab government then tried to stop it by using the Public Safety Act. There was a case of the extreme left, the Communist Party. They were publishing certain pamphlets in the state of Madras. And they went to court. And there again, the court actually struck down both these acts, the East Punjab and the Madras Act, on the ground that, you were trying to book someone under sedition, but the Constitution at that point only said that you could restrict free speech if it tended to undermine the security of the state or try to overthrow it. And the court said that speech alone is highly unlikely ever to undermine or overthrow the state, and therefore this restriction is bad, right? Another judgment came also from the Bihar High Court, Justice Sarju Prasad, but he took free speech to a different level altogether. He said that even if I incite people to murder, that is protected speech. So the moment these judgments came, again, RSS and communists, our prime minister at that point of time woke up and said, well, this doesn't quite suit us, and immediately a backpedaling started happening. And the very constitution makers who had given that right to us in 1950, within a year and a half, undid that right. They passed the first amendment of the Constitution. And it's very important, I think, at that point of time to recollect as to what all was said. And I just, for instance, the Home Minister, the Iron Man of India today, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, said that the Crossroads decision, which is the decision of the Madras case, where the communists were allowed to actually publish their pamphlets, knocks out the bottom of most of the penal code in India. So there's that worry. Chief Minister Pant, who was Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh at that point of time, said that these are freedom of speech have been wantonly misused. Venomous and filthy attacks are being made on us against central and state governments. The same language we hear today, the same language was being used in 1950. And most shockingly, unfortunately, it's probably what Pandit Nehru, who was meant to be one of the most liberal people in our constitution, said. He said, yes, press is one of the most vital organs of modern life. You know, they always start with this point. Yes, it's very important. And then comes the sting in the tail. But then he said, is the press some kind of a responsible journal? Is it a good newspaper that we wanted to protect? But suddenly we have some 2-page news sheets which are full of vulgarity and indecency and falsehood. And then he made a very worrying comment. He said, a constitution should not limit the power of parliament to face a situation of great calamity. Now, I don't understand this. It is precisely the purpose of a constitution to control parliament. But one of India's greatest democrats, when faced with a violation of his own power, started questioning this. So what I suppose I want to say is that this shows that this tension really between the executive and the rights of the individual have been there from pretty much the word go. It's pretty much from the start. The promise has been that which is given in the constitution. The reality is the real politic of it. It's only when I try to exert my right that it makes an impact on the powers that be and they immediately clamp down upon it. And in our constitutional scheme of things, this was foreseen that obviously this tension will happen. The idea was that let us put the courts as the arbiter of any dispute between the two. And ultimately, the court is a guardian. The ultimate safeguard of the constitutional rights has been placed in the hands of the court. And one shining example of that is Article 32 of the Constitution of India, which allows any person whatsoever to go to the Supreme Court directly and say, my constitutional rights are being infringed, please come to my aid. And this right to go to the court is itself a fundamental right. It's a constitutional right that cannot be abridged. And Dr. Ambedkar is well known to have said that if there's any article which is the soul of the Constitution, it is this. And because it was understood from the very beginning that if there's any violation of any rights, it will really ultimately be the courts which will have to come to the aid of the people. So in this background, it's important to see what was the promise of the fundamental rights and exactly how has the court performed and what are the challenges today. I think a lot of us know what the challenges are, but it'll be important for me to just spell out some of what our challenges are. So in any case, as I said, a large amount of friction happens between the executive and the populace. And that's evident in our Indian Penal Code. You know, there's several sections in our penal code which are routinely used by the executive to suppress free speech. One such example is section 153A, which criminalizes promoting enmity between different groups on grounds of religion, race, place of birth, residence, and language. That's one. Then there is section 292, which criminalizes obscenity. There is 295A, which criminalizes deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage religious feelings of any class or citizens. And finally, section 298, which criminalizes any uttering of any word or making any sound with the deliberate intention of wounding the religious feelings of a person. Now, these are very worthy causes, right? Because we must remember that while I am a great supporter of free speech cannot become a license to become hate speech. At some point, when you are deliberately using language to foment hatred amongst communities, You're using language to have, in a country like ours, which is split on so many levels. We're split on the ground of caste, sex, religion, creed, gender. We have a million fractures. And especially in 1950, if you think of it, a newly born country had to be protected from people misusing the right and trying to create enmity. So it was reasonable to have these kind of restrictions in laws. But of course, the moment you have a restriction, it's always going to be abused. So the same sections that are really meant to protect hate speech were misused, for instance, in the case of Salman Rushdie. I don't know how many of you remember that. There was a book he wrote, The Satanic Verses, and there was an outcry amongst certain ultra-right within the Muslim community, and the fatwa was issued against him, and the book was banned. That's a book on Islam, equally a book on Hinduism, Wendy Doniger's book on Hinduism. I don't know if any of you have read it. It is a very erudite and a learned book, and it seems more interesting than it is because it's really a research text once you start reading it. But that book was going to be published by Penguin. And one particular person who proclaimed himself to be more Hindu than others took up cudgels on this behalf and filed multiple FIRs. Protests were raged, and these sections were used of promoting enmity, and they tried to stop the publication. Ultimately, Penguin had to cancel that particular book contract, and someone else published it. So instances of this kind of oppression abound. The question is, what does the court do about it? And I think, if you don't mind, I think this is something I'll come back to later as to what did the court do about it. Because court did do something. But often, as is the problem with the court, is not what it did, but when it did it. Because one of the biggest problems in our legal system is the delay that happens and doing something ex post facto. But please give me the permission to address you on this point a bit later, because I want to talk about now actually really the promises. So before we dwell on the bad, let's try to dwell a bit on the good as well, right? Before I puncture any great hope and faith you have in this constitutional scheme, let's at least first fill up the balloon with some hot air before we prick it with anything. So let's see 3 areas where the court has been fairly robust in protecting free speech. And I would say that has been in areas really of sedition, in areas of internet freedom, and in area of freedom of the press. And when you hear me say these things, you'll automatically be surprised saying, but the court hasn't really protected us, right? And to an extent, that's true. And that's why I'm using these particular examples to show you how there's a promise. There is language that is used in each of the judgments that protects the individual when they're exercising these free speech rights. And that's the promise. But we know the reality is something different. So when I'm addressing you on each of these 3 things, I want you to keep in your mind that how is it that this has been undermined. So let's come to the first part of it, sedition. It's become a very popular thing these days. So many people are routinely held for sedition. You just have to say something about sedition and off you go to jail. Because sedition has now come to be understood as something as allegiance to the government of the day. And that's true for every government, right? I'm not naming party political issues. Any state government or the central government, they're all up to the same trick, so to say. And one example of that, for instance, if I can straight away give is, if you take sedition, is I think there was a person called Mathur, if I'm not mistaken, who was a cartoonist. And in 2011, had published a certain cartoon on the Parliament of India. And that time the UPA government was there. And the man was harangued and harassed, sent to jail, ultimately released by the Bombay High Court, but he spent some time in jail already by then, right? So that's one example of how sedition was misused. And we see every day how sedition laws are abused. But what is the promise on this, right? So when in 1950, the Constitution was promulgated, sedition was deliberately dropped as an exception which could be used to curtail free speech. But then we saw what happened. The First Amendment came, and interest of the security of the nation was brought back in, right? So relying on this, many cases were filed, and the matter ultimately went to the Supreme Court of India, which in a very famous case of Kedarnath Singh, the validity of the section 124A, which I'll just read out for you who don't know it. I presume not all of you are lawyers. Bad luck, you won't earn that much money later. You'll become engineers and help the country other which ways, while we lawyers are giving speeches or doing other things. So in any case, section 124 says that whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by signs of visible representation or otherwise, and I see these words, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law in India shall be punished, right? So the aim of the section is that you are trying to excite disaffection. And this is not the same thing as undermining the state, because the government is one that comes and goes. The state is permanent, right? So that was a protection that has been given to the government of the day. Nevertheless, when the matter went to the Supreme Court, and you would think that, like, surely I can criticize the government and I try to overthrow the government as long as the state is not upset. But that's not what the language of the statute suggests. But luckily, the Supreme Court upheld the section by saying what? You see, normally if it had upheld it, it would have been a disaster. But the Supreme Court said that what the section really means is that sedition happens only when you are trying to overthrow the state. And they put this in the negative. They said that the section would have been unconstitutional if they were hold that even without any tendency to disorder, or even without any intention to create a disturbance of law and order, if the words merely created disaffection, the offense of sedition was made out. To put it positively, what the court said is that if you have to have sedition, you must have something more than just creating a feeling of enmity against the government. You must intend to create a disturbance in law and order. You must want to create a civil unrest, right? And I think we can live with that. I don't mind having a law which prohibits sedition if the effect of that is that there will be no civil war in our country. No one wants civil war, right? So that is the meaning of sedition today. That is a promise the Supreme Court has upheld, saying that this is what sedition means. The reality, of course, is quite different, because what the Supreme Court says and that which is found on the ground by the SHO of any police station or a person registering an FIR is very different. Their understanding is different. So we'll come to the reality part of it later. But the promise is there. The Supreme Court has come over aid and said that, look, sedition means this and only this, that you are trying to create civil war, or you're trying to create public disorder. You're going to try to create massive riots between the members of different communities. And that's what sedition is. And as I said, that's something we can completely live with. The second issue, as I said, was, and that the court has been even more robust, somewhat, has been internet freedom, right? So very famously, again, this is a case where there will be a dramatic gap between what that is said and that what is happens. So for instance, take the Kashmir internet shutdown. The matter had gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court gave a long lecture on all that which is wrong about internet shutdowns. Yeah, they said that the freedom of speech and expression through the medium of the internet enjoys constitutional protection under 19(1)(a), and any restriction must be in terms of 19(2). So this is a promise that you must have the internet cut down only in exceptional circumstances. Another thing to remember here is that in compliance with this and other judgments, we know what happens on internet and the shutdowns, and we'll come to that issue of shutdown. So in any case, I was talking of the Jammu and Kashmir judgment and how ultimately internet shutdowns are still a problem, and I'll come to that as a reality part of it. But maybe I can just address that now on the reality part of it. The fact is that while we have promise of internet, the reality is that there are constant internet shutdowns whenever there's a trouble. And not just that, even if you take the case of Rajasthan, I saw on the news the other day that there's a teacher training test and the government shuts down the net so that people can't cheat. Infringing on fundamental rights to take the easy way out is not the answer. The government has a responsibility to enforce its laws. It has a responsibility to ensure that no one cheats. But the government will always take the easy way out and say, okay, let's just stop the internet. And the problem with that is you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Especially in COVID times, we've seen this today, is that we need access to the internet, not just to hear Mr. Kirpal speak, but also to study. Children go to school now with this. It's a fundamental right. And yet the government constantly suppresses the internet. And this is where the courts have not come to our aid. So the Kashmir judgment is all well and good. It directed the government to consider to reopen it. Why did the court not pass an order saying, I hereby deem it necessary for you to restore the internet connection? If internet is part of Article 19(1)(a), it is to be protected and preserved. Then it was the constitutional responsibility of the court to ensure that it gave an order saying restore the net. You can't football something back to the wall of the government, to the court of the government, and say, okay, we've given you a rough idea, now you do the rest. It is for the court to be the bad guy. The government will not like it, but the court has to step in and perform its promised constitutional duty and restore people's faith and restore the internet. And instead of doing that, what do we have? We have in 2017 certain internet shutdown rules that have come. And if you examine those rules, they're quite amazing. In as much as first, there's no public consultation. People don't even know that these rules exist. And so DOTs come out with these. But the most important thing about that is keep Kashmir aside. The rules provide for a review of any internet shutdown within 5 days of shutting down. There's a review committee. Of course, that review committee is completely toothless. It has very little powers, but that's not the problem. Most internet shutdowns are for hours or a few days. So if you say that after 5 days, the review committee will sit, it's too late. By then, your internet has been shut. You've lost that opportunity to make yourself heard and to be known, get your ideas out there. And then 5 days later, the review committee says, well, it's been restored. I don't have to worry about it anymore, right? So this is creeping by stealth into a fundamental right. And the problem is the court has done nothing about this. It is the responsibility of the court to step in and do it. And unfortunately, as we will see later when I discuss the more generic sense of the problems in court, the court itself suffers from the same thing. Is that by the time they give any judgment, the damage is already done, right? They apply a balm over a wound, but if you're bleeding and your arteries burst and you're dead, that balm doesn't really help. But again, as I repeat, I'll come to that. So that's the second part of the internet. One area again where the court helped was in terms of Section 66A, the Shreya Singhal judgment. I think most of you will remember the famous case of those two girls in Maharashtra who, at the time of the demise of Bal Thackeray, had made certain posts saying, why should the city shut down? And a large number of people had started being arrested at that point of time. And it'll be good to remember also that Section 66A, which said that any information which is grossly offensive or has a menacing character, or any email which causes annoyance or inconvenience, it criminalized this. So if you inconvenience or annoy somebody, you are up for 3 years in jail. Now, we should remember that this enactment came at the time of UPA, right? But of course, by the time it was challenged in court, it was the NDA which had come in. So both the governments, so this is across the political divide, found it's a very useful section because they could suppress your free speech. Luckily, at this point of time, the court stepped in, and it was a very powerful bench. For those of us who appeared before them, we think of them, remember them fondly, Justice Chalameshwar and Justice Rohinton Nariman, one of the greatest purveyors of constitutional values and believers in free speech. And they struck down Section 66A of the Constitution of India on several grounds. But one of the most important grounds was that it is too vague. What causes annoyance to one, irritation to one, it's precisely the intention of having that free speech. My aim is to put my point across, which will inevitably annoy those people, irritate those people who I disagree with, right? If we are all in an echo chamber where everybody agrees, then I don't need to have free speech. So that's why they said that annoyance and irritation are such ambiguous, vague words. And even if it is grossly offensive, the whole purpose of free speech is to protect that. My right is to offend you. If I never offended you, I wouldn't need a right, right? So the right means my right to offend, my right to say something. And very importantly, and maybe even portentously, they predicted that a restriction of this sort would also have a chilling effect. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that it would unreasonably stop people from speaking out their mind. If I know that I might go to jail tomorrow for what I have said on Facebook, and I know young people don't use Facebook anymore, on the gram or Twitter or whatever else, or Snapchat, whatever you people use these days. If I can go to jail for that, I will think twice before putting it, and more likely than not, since most of us are not activists, we will not put it on. And that has a chilling effect and directly undermines the freedom of speech. So relying on these two grounds, really, and there were a host of other legal reasoning in that judgment, and it's written in simple language, so I'll ask all of you to go and read the judgment also, Shreya Singhal. They struck down Section 66A, right? So that's a promise. But again, we come to the reality. What is the reality of free speech on the net today? Bizarrely enough, even though Section 66A has been struck down, FIRs are still being registered under the section. Now that's completely illegal, So much so that the central government had to give advisories to the state government, because as you know, public law and order is the role of the state government. Central government issued an advisory. In spite of that, FIR upon FIR is still today in India being filed under Section 66A, to the extent that in July of this year, Justice Nariman has issued another order directing that it be publicized that Section 66 has been struck down. It reminds me of another that, as Udin said at the beginning, I appeared in the Navdeep Johar judgment, and Section 377 had been struck down. Now, supposing that is still applied today, even though it's been struck down, it's akin to that. Then what's the point of fighting a constitutional legal battle if in the ground that's still being applied, right? So the promise is the court, I'm writing this beautiful judgment protecting your rights. Reality, the police is still applying Section 66A, right? So this is the second part, I suppose, of 66. And the third, I suppose, is the freedom of press. And that has been, all of this has been one of the most jealously guarded areas of in our constitution. One of the first judgments was Sakal newspapers, which said that freedom of the press is a particularly special kind of freedom of expression. Because really, it's to the press and the media that we get all our information. And therefore, if you value freedom, you must have a protection of free speech. And the courts have gone much further and said that it's not only that we will come and stop censorship, because that's one way to influence what the media is saying. Governments are very quite clever. So for instance, in the Express newspapers case, what the government did was increase the price of newsprint dramatically. It became so expensive that they couldn't afford to publish newspapers and people couldn't afford to buy it. So that's one way of controlling free speech. And the court struck down that increase, saying that your intention is not to increase revenues, but your intention is to stop free speech. So the courts have been always amazing in trying to protect free speech of the. But then again, as I said, I'm sorry, we come to the reality of it. And I think there are a large number of articles today that have come, which have all said that India today is amongst the least free in journalistic freedom. We have instances of journalists being killed in Chhattisgarh. That's physical violence. We all know of Gauri Lankesh, a journalist who was killed for questioning certain crazily held views. So there is a massive lack of press freedom today, even though the court has promised we will protect it. The reality is we do not have press freedom. And that will, I suppose, now bring me to think of the causes as to why there is a lack of press freedom. Well, one example, one straight away that comes to the question is, you don't need to control the press, protection of freedom, if you control the ownership of the media houses, right? That is one of the biggest problems in India, is the lack of transparency of which media house owns which newspaper, which television channel. None of us know this, right? Other parts of the world, this is public information. I should know as to who owns a particular newspaper or a TV channel, but we don't know this. At the moment you don't know this, it's very easy for government to just pick up the phone and say, don't kill the story. You won't need censorship because a lot of this is happening at the backroom level, right? So that is the reality of today. And for that, we need greater independent media through maybe social media, which is why the government is slightly afraid of it. And that's why the government tries to suppress social media through internet bans or through prosecutions under 66A or 154A, etc. So that's one part of that. But I think two things I would like to think of particularly here, and then I'll leave it on that, is how is it that the reality of India today is in free speech? The two common ways which are used are by private entities. It's not the government that is impinging on your free speech today, largely, because they've, as I said, and this has always been the case by every government, is that they can somehow manipulate the media through carrots or sticks. One of the greatest threats to free speech is through private action. It's one person stopping another person's free speech. And while that seems, you wonder as to what does the government have to do with it? One person is stopping another person. What does the government have to do with it? It is the government's responsibility to create an atmosphere or a space where free speech is possible. It's not enough for government to say that, well, someone else has interfered, all right, what can I do? No, there is an obligation cast upon government to ensure that any person who wants to speak out freely will have his constitutional right protected, will have her constitutional right protected. You cannot do this. You cannot rub your hands off it. But what is it that I mean by saying private people impinge on other people's free speech? Now, this happens typically of two ways. One, the misuse of the defamation laws. And the second is through the sections I mentioned earlier, 66A, 154 sedition, on spreading enmity, you go and file an FIR against someone, right? One private person will file an FIR against another person. So we can just take defamation first. Very few countries in the world allow for criminal defamation. India is one of the few countries we are one of the India's world's largest democracy. So we're one of the very few democracies which has criminal defamation, section 499. When someone defames you, you can sue them, go to court, get damages, matter will be tried. If your reputation has been sullied, you will get compensation to remedy that. But in India, because our criminal justice is so slow, that the threat is the punishment, right? You send someone to jail today, even if they get ultimately acquitted 10 years later, you ruin that person's life. Spending any time in incarceration severely devalues your sense of self-worth. So when I accuse you of criminal defamation, I lodge an FIR against you, and you think I might go to jail, you have a chilling effect. You step back, right? So this is the problem with criminal defamation. Not that ultimately you will be convicted, because criminal defamation has been upheld again. So this is one of the promised reality things. There's a judgment of Justice Deepak Mishra upholding Section 499, saying that criminal defamation is to be used in the exceptional circumstance. It is very rarely meant to be used. It has got a very narrow purpose. But the fact of the matter is that whatever the Supreme Court says, when I go to the police station, my local thana, and I'm in cohorts with the SHO there, I get an FIR registered. And then the person against whom the FIR is registered is made to run from pillar to post, try to have that FIR quashed. That is a problem. It's not the conviction, it's the process in India. For instance, and also that often they don't quash the FIR. So for instance, you take the case of Vinod Dua. He made certain statements on COVID, and ultimately a host of FIRs were lodged against him. He went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court granted him bail, but didn't quash the FIR, saying, no, you go and fight that out. Why? Why not quash the FIR? Right? So that's really as regards defamation. And the second, as I said, is the use and abuse of the other provisions, sedition and promoting enmity, etc. And there again, I think the problem is that while ultimately you will be acquitted, because these very high standards that had to be met of criminality, if you're arrested in the meanwhile, if the police knocks on your door as they do unearthly hours, if you receive death threats, that is the way your free speech is curtailed. And that is the responsibility of government, I say today, to ensure a space where people are free, where people are safe, particularly women, minors, members of the minority community who face trolls every day. These safe spaces need to be created, not by having intermediary rules the way you do now, trying to suppress Twitter, but through active other legislation which will, right? Because the name of creating a safe space, the government will try to take away your rights. And really, as citizens, students of the law, and as a populace, we must be very wary of every time any government tries to take away our rights, posing it as a benefit to ourselves. We are too keen and too quick to surrender our rights, thinking that the government is there to protect us. No, the government is not there to protect you. Well, largely it is. It's supposed to, but in many areas, especially free speech, the government is not going to protect your rights. The government is often going to impinge it. So who will come to your aid? As I said right at the beginning, the courts. And here I would say the courts have let us down, not because they haven't given the right judgments. They have, as I gave you instance upon instance of right judgments. The courts have let us down because courts do what they always do, which is move at their own speed. Courts are not fast enough, robust enough, quick enough to see that there is a case of violation of free speech. Let me quickly step in, protect that person today. There's no point saying 20 years later, well, that was a great wrong done to you. The courts need to be more proactive. And courts will be proactive when citizens are proactive, when we move the court. So really, I'd like to end this because I think I've spoken more than I should in any case. I promised not to speak very much, but here I am. Once I start, I can't stop. But I beseech all of you really as citizens, more is that every time you see a violation of free speech, stand up and fight against it. When you see the government framing rules which they say are for your benefit, don't take their word for it. Educate yourself. Make yourself aware. Think about it. And fight whenever you can. If you need to go to court, go to court. But that's what it is today. India's tryst with freedom, as Pandit Nehru said, had just begun. We are some 70 years down from the constitution and some 75 years almost from our Amrit Mahotsav. But I leave this chat slightly despondent. You have youthful hope, youthful optimism, and I hope you can leave behind a cleaner and a better place for India than what I could manage to do. I'm still trying, but the future is in your hands, and I hope one day that the reality will match the promise of our constitution. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much for a very powerful appeal and one that we all applaud the positions you have taken. And I certainly hope, as I began by telling you that this is a university, this is not about politics, but this is about worrying about mankind, about the society, and about public welfare and what will make us flourish. So, narratives which are apolitical must flourish under the tent or the roof of the university.
Right.
Dear students, the questions are open now. You can type them in chat or Q&A and we'll take them one by one. But let me begin by asking you, by picking up on the last point that you said. And if I may be allowed to summarize, you talked about the courts being slow and the issues being complex. So we get lost into the word plays and interpretations, etc., which allows the parties with adversarial intentions to weaponize justice. The instance of police knocking on the door, death threats, etc., and filing FIR can be likened to weaponizing justice to suit private purposes, which are not necessarily in favor of public welfare. What can be done? Is there any judicial thinking or jurisprudence about, or the concern about this weaponization?
Let me add another weapon to your arsenal, unfortunately. And what you're saying is absolutely correct. For instance, therefore, see defamation. Big media, big corporate concerns will send a notice of defamation to some press person. And you sue someone for 200 crores, 500, fantastical amounts, right? These big corporates can afford to do it. So they weaponize defamation. Well, the only thing to do then is for the court to step in. Living in a society which is governed by the rule of law, we have no option to do that which the law requires. We should not become that we fear, right? We cannot take law into our own hands. We have to use the tools the law has given us. So I suppose to stop the weaponization really would require just exactly what I have said, is you need to go to court. You have to follow the criminal process. I suppose one thing that could be done, and that is to be done really by parliament and not by court, is to allow in matters of defamation or other, maybe say prior permission. And that was one of the points raised in Shreya Singhal, saying that if you are 66A, why not have, say, a review committee that is required to give a positive yes before you can register an FIR. But the government is not likely to do that. And the court does not have the constitutional powers to direct that to happen, right? Because this was a prayer made in Vinod Dua as well, Vinod Dua's case, saying that before such a case is registered, constitute a committee which will weed out frivolous cases or cases of weaponization, as you said. But the court said, well, that may be a good idea, but there's nothing we can do because the power of legislation under our constitution is vested in parliament, not with us. I mean, of course, they're completely oblivious to the fact that they step in and make law when they want to, right? But on this one, they chose not to. So I suppose the trick is use courts and put pressure on parliament. That's what's best we can do.
There are a number of questions. I want to be sensitive to your time. It is 2 minutes to 6. Are you available, sir?
I'm in no rush. Please, I'm speaking to young people. I'm always happy.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me begin by asking a question that Professor Pallavi, she teaches law.
Right.
She is saying, do you think the time is right to outlaw criminal aspects of contempt of court in India?
Absolutely. I think it's an archaic provision to have criminal contempt of court, right? And to your law students, while Pallavi already knows what we mean by criminal contempt, when you commit contempt of court, it's of two sorts, right? One is a disobedience of an order of the court. The court tells you to do something, you don't do it. That's called civil contempt. You'll go to jail if you do it, but nevertheless, it's civil contempt. So just because you go to jail doesn't make it criminal. Criminal contempt is when you abuse a judge or you scandalize the court, is the word that is used in the Contempt of Courts Act, right? If I say something about a judge, which tends to undermine their authority. And I would say that this is completely an outdated provision. It should go because it is used by the people who are supposed to uphold your right to free speech to curtail your free speech. It is an absurd provision. The role of the courts is to be the guardians of our fundamental rights, and this provision is used by the courts themselves to stop you from speaking out, right? And for every person, every right-thinking judge, 100 right-thinking judges, there may be one maverick judge who will use this particular provision against its intent and spirit. So it's best to get rid of it. It's been gotten rid of in the UK, where our Contempt of Courts Act has been modeled after. And surely, as a court in judgment upon judgment in civil contempt, Arundhati Roy, for instance, says that the shoulders of the court are broad enough to bear any allegation made against it, right? And if the shoulders of the court are broad enough, they should be broad enough to take criticism, right? Everyone should be able to take criticism without having a weaponized method, as you said, Professor, including the courts. So contempt, criminal contempt, I'm completely against it.
Vanchika Mudgal likens the farm laws protests, the protests against farm laws, and impedance on the right to movement. So if you argue that protests against farm laws are an expression of freedom of speech, it impedes my right to move freely in my country. Is one freedom more important than the other?
Well, of course it is. You see, every freedom inevitably has to be balanced. And that's well understood, well appreciated. But to allow a freedom of movement would mean to completely curtail any right to protest, right? So these are almost incompatible rights. So then you have to see as a court, which they will, is that how do we balance the two rights? Because the law is on what? On restriction 19.2 to 19.6, all have the term reasonable restriction. The law is that you must take the least invasive method to curtail any right. So you can curtail my right to protest because it's causing a right to freedom of movement being curtailed by the least invasive method. Maybe a method could be you have alternative routes. Now that might increase your traffic time, but then increase in traffic time is not stopping your freedom of movement. It is curtailing your right of freedom of movement, and therefore some balancing act with someone else's right to free speech, right? If supposing there was no other way of getting to another place, then maybe a different consideration would apply. So then you have to maybe remove the protesters. So it's a fact-based situation, and the court repeatedly has said that there can be no formula which will fit all. You see, on a case-by-case basis, yes, there is undoubtedly a conflict between freedom of movement and free speech, and the balance will be drawn. And as I say in these things, the best balance is where everyone is unhappy, because that means everyone's rights have been protected to some extent.
But as an aside, isn't this within the domain of the executive rather than judiciary? Why should every referral go to judiciary?
Well, you're absolutely right on that. I think the court had no reason or business to take upon itself this issue of the farm laws in Justice Bobde's time. The court is wrong to try to lay guidelines and formulae and policies now. I think it's a case of misguided attempt to put balm on hurt egos and souls. That is not your job. And I say very simple. Why is that? Because if you, the Supreme Court today, decide a particular thing, and the farmer or the commuter think they have been wronged by this particular order, what is their redress? Where will they go for justice? Because once the Supreme Court says something, there is no court sitting above that against which you can go. So this is one of those strange things where ultimately you have no legal redress. There's no judicial review, there's no review of any sort. And you could be completely wrong. And yet you're stuck with it. So it is not the role of the court. The court should not take upon itself to become part of the executive. As I said in the Vinod Dua case, when you said that you're not going to lay down guidelines or when an FIR should be filed, then why should you say how should protests be held?
Arushi refers to Cinematograph Amendment Bill of 2021, which seeks to give revisional powers to central government with respect to film certification. is this not excessive? And does this not pose threat to freedom of speech?
Undoubtedly, any power that has been given to executive authorities is worrying. And I dare say, if this revisional power is given to the executive without any appeal, see, as of now, there is a body headed by a judicial member to which an appeal will lie for any decision on film certification. I have no doubt that the court will strike down any such thing and say that writ jurisdiction will always be available, and courts will always be able to supervise any view, because you can't allow a power to the executive to decide that which violates free speech. For instance, would we allow the executive to decide in itself its tax demand? No. You need someone else to say that the executive has raised this tax is wrong, the citizen has to have some independent place other than the executive itself. The same thing with the Cinematographic Act. It's not correct to have just revisional authority with the central government. They often do provide such. There are many other acts, let me also tell you, where revisional authority is with the central government. It has always been understood that if a revisional power is exercised, that will be subject matter of judicial review, and the courts will ultimately have the final say. So, and the judicial review is a fundamental feature or a basic structure of our constitution and cannot be changed. And that's a good way, I suppose, maintaining some control.
Right. Coming to social media, Vishakha wants to know about this episode of social media blocking our content on the governmental orders. And so she's asking, the new rules for intermediaries, information technology rules 2021, are they justified?
Well, I think it's a case of, as I said initially, is that when rules are given by government, and these intermediary rules have been given by the government ostensibly, and this is the justification that constantly comes, is that we're trying to create a safe space, right? I just don't trust the government when they say that, when they're trying to create a safe space. If these rules don't exist elsewhere in the world, why does India need to have them, right? It's working, okay. Social media is not a perfect space. It needs regulation, undoubtedly. But I think these intermediary rules, what are the intermediary rules? Let's just to tell your audience who are not lawyers, is that, today, social media platforms like Facebook has certain immunity if a person posts something on it or on Twitter, because Twitter is not liable for the content that is coming on it. So if they have certain protections. Those protections are now sought to be undone or rejigged, I would say, not undone. So there are certain set of stringent guidelines that have to be followed before you get those protections as an intermediary. And if you do not place into place a grievance redressal officer, etc., a whole host of people who are all based in India, then you will lose your status as an intermediary. And the problem is that there are so many people who have so many layers of regulation that have been attached for intermediaries, that even the UN Special Rapporteur has actually written a letter saying that this will amount to a chilling effect on free speech. And I have asked the government to reconsider these regulations. You see, sometimes what we do is we hear the word regulation and we close our minds and think the government is doing it for my good, it's regulation. But no, as students of law and as concerned citizens, as I said, you must ask what is specific about that. We've dumbed down a bit ourselves. We've lost nuance. So no one is saying regulation is bad. The question is what form that regulation is taking. And we therefore must ask ourselves, is this the least restrictive way to stop anything? And answer no. This is going to be a tool in the hands of government to get the social media to bend to its will, something I'm not willing to accept.
Right. Himanshu Rathi wants to know, when the government uses or political parties use big data to alter voting behavior and citizens' behavior, does that in some way compromise the freedom of speech and expression?
Well, I would say it undermines Article 21. And to an extent, yes, because the Supreme Court has held in multiple cases that your right to vote it amounts to a part of freedom of speech. Why, when you require affidavits to be filed by the Election Commission of the candidates' assets, it's part of free speech, right? So you must be fully informed. But what you're talking about is the reverse of that, when the government has access to your data. Now, that I may not think is really free speech. That would really be a case of violation of your autonomy and your Article 21 rights. And of course, I don't know if you are a student of law when you're asking this, it doesn't matter whether it's 21 or 191A, because till a judgment called R.C. Cooper came, it's called the bank nationalization case. The law in India was that if you have one right, you don't have another right. So if you're Article 19 right, you don't have an Article 21 right. Then came this famous judgment of Cooper's case, bank nationalization, explained in Menaka Gandhi's case, which said that no, all rights are kind of a rainbow. They work together in harmony and in tandem. So while it may not strictly be part of 19, one facet of it may be protected by 21, but you read 19 and 21 together to give a more meaningful right to a citizen. The idea is courts will try to expand rights of citizens. Yeah? So coming back to your specific question, I gave you a generic legal answer on really big data being gathered. There, I'm afraid I'm not so much a conspiracy theorist. I don't have any evidence to see, which has been shown to me at least. And I'm open, and please feel free to send me a tweet or whatever else as to what evidence you have that government has used big data to change voting patterns. Now, political parties often do use that, right, to try to target its voters. But that's democracy. That's freedom. That's their freedom, right? They have a right to try to reach out their voters. Any data leak is a violation of my fundamental right. So that's one aspect as well.
So we are 11 minutes past, so I will ask you just this last question.
Please do. Thank you.
Want to respect your time.
Thanks.
When you have made a very, very powerful appeal and plea for free speech, and it has put the burden back on citizens, given how institutions are working today. When do we expect to see you as a judge?
That is your free speech, and mine, I think, is 19.2 restriction. In interests of security of the state, I better not answer that. But I've often spoken of this, so I don't ever stop myself. I will say the ball is out of my court. There are 3 wise men sitting in the Supreme Court. They will do what they will do, and we shall soon find out. I'm in it for the long haul. I never did it for myself. I did it for a cause. And I hope many of your students will go on, and I hope to see many of them on the bench one day. Please don't ever refuse an offer when it's made to you, because it is part of your social obligation. It's part of your social conscience. And again, maybe we can end with that, is that you don't have a right to complain if you don't do anything about it, right? So this ties in back to the same point, that do your best in whichever manner you can, however you can. I did my best by accepting. It's out of my hands. We shall see.
Sir, we certainly hope that hope to see you there. You have our best wishes. Thank you very much with us for spending a wonderful evening on a topic that is by no means easy, but you have made it sound so simple. And
thank you very much. And I also thank all of you, your students, who have patiently heard me all this while. It's a Friday evening. Now go and do what students do. Don't let us lecturers say otherwise. And thank you once again to you, Professor, and to the whole North Cap University for giving me this opportunity to speak to the future of India. Thank you very much.
So we'll hope to see you physically in the campus one day when COVID restrictions aren't there.
This too shall pass.
And this too shall pass. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.